The lighthouse keeper of Wrenhaven Point. By the time the fog began to gather at Wrenhaven Point, the day had already become gentle around the edges. The last color of sunset rested low behind the western clouds, not bright enough to dazzle the water, but enough to leave a soft pewter shine on the tide pools below the rocks. The path up to the lighthouse curved through coarse grass and low sea lavender, past the small whitewashed keeper's cottage, and on toward the round stone tower that stood at the headland, like a patient candle waiting for evening. There was no storm that night, no shouting gulls, no urgent bells from the harbor, no sailors running along wet planks with ropes in their hands. Only fog. And fog was a familiar visitor at Wrenhaven Point. It came first as a pale breath over the water, then as a silvery veil between the headland and the village roofs, then as a quiet softness that made every sound seem nearer and kinder. The sea below moved slowly against the stones, with a hush and return, as if it were smoothing the night before anyone stepped into it. Miriam Vale paused at the cottage gate with a folded cloth over one arm and a brass key in her hand. She was the keeper of Wrenhaven Light, and she had a way of standing still before work began, not because she was uncertain, but because she liked to give the evening one honest look before she changed it. Her dark wool skirt was plain and practical. Her shawl was pinned close at the throat. Her hair, the color of strong tea, had been braided and wound low so that stray sea wind could not have its way with it. Across the harbor, the first windows of Wrenhaven village were beginning to glow. One belonged to the baker's wife, who always lit her kitchen lamp before the clock at the chapel struck 7. Another belonged to the sailmaker, whose workroom window often shone late into misty evenings. Farther down, where the lane bent toward the quay, a yellow square appeared in the post office window, then disappeared as someone passed before it, then appeared again. To Miriam, those little lights were not separate from the lighthouse. They were the smaller stars of the same shore. She opened the tower door and stepped inside. The air within held the cool mineral smell of stone, the faint clean scent of lamp oil, and the dry whisper of rope and pulley. The tower stairs curled upward in a steady spiral, worn smooth in the center by years of careful feet. Miriam set one hand on the rail and began to climb, taking the steps at the pace she used every evening. Not rushed, not slow, simply exact. The lighthouse did not ask for haste. It asked for attention. At the first landing, she stopped beside the small store cupboard and checked the spare wicks. Each one lay wrapped in paper, trimmed clean and straight. She touched the bundle lightly, as if greeting a shelf of sleeping birds, then closed the cupboard door. At the second landing, she lifted the barometer from its hook and read it beneath the wall lamp, steady. At the third, she listened through the narrow window slit. The fog bell below the cliff had not yet begun its regular note, but the sea was already muffled, and the village seemed farther away than its lamp suggested. The lantern room waited at the top of the tower beneath curved panes of glass. During the day it looked almost ordinary. Metalwork, polished brass, a circular gallery, the great lamp arranged with the calm precision of a useful instrument. But at dusk, before the flame was lit, it had a private stillness. The glass caught the remaining sky. The brass held a low amber memory of earlier evenings. The lens, carefully cleaned, stood ready to gather one flame and send it outward in a steady, turning promise. Miriam placed her folded cloth on the work table and began with the panes. She worked around the room slowly, wiping away the faint salt film that the afternoon air had left behind. There was no visible dirt to most eyes, only a slight dimming, a softness where clarity ought to be. But a lighthouse was made of small accuracies. A cloth passed one way instead of another, a wick trimmed by a breath, a screw tightened before it complained, a note written while the detail was fresh. These small things were the difference between a light that merely burned and a light that could be trusted. When the glass had been cleaned, she turned to the lamp itself. The wick rose evenly. The oil level was right. The chimney glass sat without strain. Miriam trimmed a thread from the edge of the wick and dropped it into a small tin. then stepped back to consider the whole arrangement. The fog beyond the windows had thickened. It pressed softly against the lantern room, not as an enemy, but as a curtain waiting to receive the light. At 7, she lit the lamp. The flame took at once, modest and blue at the base, gold at the top. It grew, settled, and became steady. Miriam lowered the glass, adjusted the air, and watched the first brightening move through the lens. The room changed. Brass warmed, shadows slid into their proper places. Outside, the gallery rail appeared and disappeared in the fog. And then the first sweep of Wrenhaven light moved out across the headland, across the hidden water, and into the soft gray evening down below. In the cottage kitchen, the kettle had begun to sound faintly on the stove. Miriam did not leave the lantern at once. She watched 3 full turns of the light, as she always did, one for the sea, one for the village, one for the keeper who must be sure before she allowed herself tea. The motion was smooth. The flame held its shape. No flicker, no sputter, no uneven breath. Only the turning room, the fog, and the warm circle traveling out into the night. She descended carefully and entered the cottage through the side door. The kitchen was small, scrubbed, and comfortable, with a black stove, a blue jug of spoons, a plain wooden table, and a shelf of cups, whose handles all turned the same way. A narrow bedchamber opened beyond a curtain. Beside the kitchen window stood the logbook desk, where Miriam kept the station records. The desk faced the harbor, though on foggy nights the harbor was no more than a suggestion, a place known by habit rather than sight. She poured hot water over tea leaves, covered the pot with a knitted cozy, and opened the logbook. Her handwriting was neat, but not decorative. Fog forming from west by southwest at 6:40. Light lit at 7 precisely. Barometer steady. Sea calm. Village lamps, visible only at intervals. She paused over the last phrase and smiled. The little visible only at intervals. Many true things were like that. A soft knock came at the outer door. Miriam closed the ink bottle before she rose. At Wrenhaven Point, people knocked differently depending on the weather. In clear weather, the knock was ordinary, a simple announcement. In wind, it was louder, made with the side of a fist. In fog, people knocked as though the house itself might be sleeping. This was a fog knock. On the step stood Mr. Alder Finch, the retired sailmaker, with a canvas roll beneath one arm and a misting of droplets silvering the shoulders of his coat. He was not in a hurry. Nobody climbed to Wrenhaven Point in fog if they expected to keep hurry in their pockets. "Evening, Miss Vale," he said. "I've brought the flags back before the damp makes a rumor of them." "Then we had better not give the damp time to speak," Miriam replied, "and let him in." Mr. Finch wiped his boots carefully on the mat and leaned the canvas roll against the kitchen wall. He had repaired 2 signal flags that week, not because anyone expected urgent signaling that night, but because good order on a coast was often prepared on quiet evenings. Miriam cleared a space on the table, and together they unrolled the cloth. Red, cream, and blue lay in softened folds beneath the lamplight, the stitches small and even where the fabric had been worn. "You still mend like a man who thinks the sea will inspect the seams," Miriam said. "The sea has always had opinions," said Mr. Finch. "Best not to disappoint it." She laughed softly and set a cup of tea before him. Outside, the fog bell gave its first low note from the cliff path below. It was not loud in the cottage, only a rounded sound that moved through the walls and then faded, leaving the room quieter than before. Mr. Finch lifted his cup, but did not drink at once. "I remember," he said, "when your father kept this light, and the old bell had a crack in it. Every stroke sounded like someone asking a question." Miriam knew the story, but she let him tell it. This was one of the small services a quiet evening required. Some lamps needed trimming, some memories needed room to walk around the table. Fog came in just after supper. Mr. Finch continued. "Thick as wool. Your father said the cracked bell would do for one more night, and your mother said that if it asked a question, the light had better answer. So he lit the lamp early, and your mother put a candle in every window of this cottage. From the harbor, they said the whole point looked like a house keeping watch with both eyes open. Miriam looked toward the kitchen window, where her own reflection rested faintly over the fog. The tower light swept beyond the glass in regular intervals, brightening the window frame and then passing on. Her parents had been gone many years, but there were evenings when their habits seemed less like memories, and more like well-made tools still hanging where they had always belonged. "I don't light every cottage window," she said after a moment. "No," said Mr. Finch. "You keep the log more neatly than your father did. That may count for 2 candles. The fog bell sounded again. Finch finished his tea, tied the repaired flags in their canvas roll, and rose before his niece had the chance to object. Miriam walked with him to the door. On the step, the fog had thickened so much that the tower was only a pale shape rising beside them, though its light moved faithfully through the air above. "Will you manage the path?" she asked. "I know every stone of it," he said. "And if I forget one, it will introduce itself." She stood at the door until his lantern became a soft coin in the fog, and then vanished down the path. After that, she set the flags on the shelf beside the signal cupboard and returned to the tower. The climb warmed her after the open door. By the time she reached the lantern room, the lamp had completed many turns, each as even as the first. She checked the flame, the oil feed, the glass. The fog beyond the gallery was so dense now that the beam seemed to carve a golden tunnel only a little way before the mist swallowed it. But that was not failure. A light did not need to see its own arrival to be useful. On the gallery outside, the air was cool and wet. Miriam stepped out and closed the door behind her. The rail beneath her hand was slick with fog. Below, the cliff path had disappeared. The village had disappeared. Even the sea had become invisible, though its low breathing continued beneath everything. Wrenhaven light turned behind her, and each sweep made the fog briefly luminous, like muslin held before a candle. Miriam listened. The bell below gave its patient note. The water answered in its own slower way. Somewhere inland, a cartwheel rolled over stones and then softened into silence. She thought of the village people moving through their evening. The baker covering tomorrow's loaves, the postmistress closing her drawer, the sailmaker hanging his damp coat, children being called from doorsteps by mothers whose voices the fog made tender. They could not see the lighthouse clearly from below, but they knew it was there. That knowledge was part of the shore. When she returned to the cottage, there was another sound at the door. Quicker this time, followed by a careful stamping of boots. Miriam opened it to find Tom Arlen, the post-runner, holding his cap against his chest and trying to look older than 16 while fog dripped from his fringe. "Tied note from the harbor master," he said, offering a folded paper. "And Mrs. Pell sent to loaf. She said lighthouse work is easier if supper behaves." "Mrs. Pell has firm opinions about bread," Miriam said. "Yes, Miss everyone knows." She took the paper and the wrapped loaf. The message was simple. The evening packet had delayed departure until morning because of the fog. No concern, no emergency, just an adjustment, the kind that kept a harbor sensible. Miriam wrote it into the logbook and turned to find Tom still standing near the mat. "You may sit by the stove for 5 minutes," she said. "If you carry fog back to your mother, she will blame the lighthouse." Tom's relief was immediate, though he tried to hide it. He sat on the bench near the stove and held his hands toward the heat. Miriam cut 2 slices from Mrs. Pell's loaf, buttered one for him, and set the other beside her own cup. For a few minutes, the kitchen held the small sounds of butter on bread, the stove settling, the clock ticking, the bell sounding beyond the walls. "Is it lonely up here?" Tom asked suddenly. Miriam considered the question honestly. Adults often asked it with an answer already prepared, but Tom asked as if he were opening a gate and did not know what field lay beyond it. "Sometimes," she said, "but not in the way people think. A lonely place can still be companionable if it has work that matters." Tom nodded as though this required thought. I suppose the light has company, then, ships and windows and all that. And fog bells, said Miriam. And post runners who bring sensible bread. He grinned into his slice and then remembered to look solemn. When his 5 minutes had become 8, he rose, thanked her, and tucked his cap back on his head. Miriam gave him a small lantern for the path, and told him to return it in the morning. Not because he needed permission to borrow it, but because returning things in the morning gave a village one more reason to begin again. After Tom left, the cottage felt larger for a moment. Miriam closed the door, brushed crumbs from the table, and carried the harbor master's note to the logbook. Peepang delayed until morning. Fog dense but calm. Bell sounding at regular intervals. Light steady. She looked at the final sentence before she wrote it. Light steady. There was comfort in the plainness of it. Some sentences did not need embroidery. The next hour moved in its quiet round. Tower, lamp, cottage, logbook, window. Tower, lamp, cottage, stove. Miriam climbed and descended as the keeper before her had done, and the keeper before him, and others whose names are written in older books with browning edges. She did not feel like the owner of the light. She felt like a careful hand passing along a cup that must not spill. In the lantern room, she polished a small thumbprint from the brass and checked the wick. In the cottage, she folded Mr. Finch's repaired flags into the signal cupboard. At the cliff door, she listened to the fog bell and counted the spaces between each note. The rhythm was right. At the kitchen table, she mended a tear in the cuff of her work apron with thread the color of oatmeal. The stitch was not beautiful, but it held. Near 10 o'clock, the fog thinned for a few minutes. It did not clear. It only lifted enough to reveal the harbor as a faint arrangement of darker shapes. The masts of small boats appeared like fine pencil lines. The quay lamps wore halos. The chapel roof rose and vanished. Then, for one breath, Miriam saw the far window of the sailmaker's room, still lit, and another window beside it where someone had placed a candle close to the glass. The light turned, the candle answered. Then the fog closed again. Miriam stood very still, her hand resting on the table. There was nothing dramatic in the moment. No rescue, no alarm, no message sent across impossible distances. Only a lighthouse and a village remembering each other through the mist. Yet it gave her a feeling she did not want to disturb by naming. She poured the last of the tea and let the warmth sit between her hands. At 10:30, she took the small basket from beside the stove and went to the lower storeroom. It was not a grand room, only a dry space built into the base of the tower, where rope, spare glass, oil cans, brushes, and folded cloths were kept in orderly arrangement. Miriam liked the storeroom. It was proof that readiness did not have to announce itself. The useful things waited quietly in their places until called upon. She checked the storm lanterns, though no storm was expected. She checked the spare bell rope, though the bell was sound. She checked the oilcloth, the matches, the hinges of the cupboard, and the small tin of screws. In the corner stood a wooden crate that had belonged to her mother, marked only by a pattern of blue paint along one edge. Miriam lifted the lid and found, as she knew she would, the old candle holders wrapped in cloth. For a moment she thought of lighting every cottage window, as her mother had done on the night of the cracked bell. The idea moved through her like a draft under a door. Then she smiled, shook her head, and took only one candle holder from the crate. Not every tradition had to be repeated exactly to be kept alive. Some could be answered in a quieter language. She set the candle in the kitchen window, trimmed it, and lit it from the stove. Its flame was small compared with the tower light, hardly more than a golden bead. But it changed the window. It made the cottage seem awake from within. Miriam looked at it from the doorstep, standing beneath the low lintel with fog dampening her shawl. Above her, Wrenhaven light continued its steady turn. Beside her, the kitchen candle waited in its square of glass. The house, as Mr. Finch had said, kept watch with both eyes open. Midnight came without ceremony. The fog bell continued. The sea moved below. In the lantern room, the flame held clean and calm. Miriam wrote the hour into the logbook and added, "Cottage candle lit in west kitchen window." There was no official need to record it, but logbooks were not only for necessity, they were also for the small truths that helped a later keeper understand what kind of night had passed through the station. She took one final round before allowing herself to rest in the chair beside the kitchen stove, up the tower, around the lamp, across the gallery, down the stairs, through the storeroom, past the signal cupboard, into the cottage. Each door closed softly behind her. Each latch found its place. At the kitchen window, the candle had burned lower, but its flame remained steady. Miriam sat with her shawl around her shoulders, and the logbook open on her lap. She did not intend to sleep, only to rest her eyes between rounds. The clock ticked, the stove breathed, the fog bell sounded from below the cliff, not lonely now, but companionable. A deep note moving through the woolen dark. The tower light passed the window again, and each time it did, the kitchen brightened for a second, then returned to its smaller glow. In the village, most lamps were out, the baker's window had gone dark, the post office was quiet. The sailmaker's workroom had finally surrendered its light, but somewhere beyond the fog, Wrenhaven still lay gathered around its harbor, with roofs, lanes, doors, boats, and sleeping rooms all held inside the knowledge that the point was watched. Miriam thought of Tom returning the lantern in the morning. She thought of Mr. Finch checking the weather before breakfast. She thought of Mrs. Pell slicing a new loaf and saying, as she always did, that bread must be practical before it was poetic. The fog did not lift, but it softened. It became less like a wall and more like a blanket laid over the shore. Wrenhaven light turned through it, patient and warm. The cottage candle burned low. The sea continued its hush and return, and return. And the night settled into the kind of quiet that does not ask to be understood. It is enough to be inside it, to let the lamp do its work, to let the bell keep time, and to know that every small steady thing has its place. By the last round before dawn, the eastern edge of the sky had begun to pale behind the fog. Miriam climbed the tower once more. The flame was still even. The glass was clear. The lantern room smelled of warm metal and clean oil. She opened the gallery door and stepped into the cold blue hush. Below, the tide had turned. The rocks breathed with water. A gull called once from somewhere unseen and then seemed to think better of it. Across the harbor, one window appeared. Then another. The village was returning by pieces. Miriam watched the first gray shape of the chapel roof come into view, then the line of the quay, then the upper story of the sailmaker's house. The fog had not gone. It was only becoming transparent enough to share the morning. Behind her, the light continued to turn, though soon it would be put out and cleaned for the next evening. She rested both hands on the gallery rail. The night had asked nothing grand of her. No vessel had needed guiding through danger. No alarm had rung. No heroic entry would be written in the station book. And still, the work had mattered. The lamp had been kept. The bell had sounded. The village had slept. A boy had warmed his hands. An old sailmaker had told a story. A candle had answered a memory without trying to become it. When Miriam returned to the lantern room, she waited for one final sweep of light that moved through the lens, across the glass into the thinning fog, and outward toward the harbor where morning was gathering itself. She lowered the flame carefully, as her father had taught her, as the tower required, as every quiet useful thing deserves to be handled. The room dimmed by degrees. Down in the cottage, the kitchen candle had gone out on its own, leaving a little curl of smoke and a clean pool of wax. Miriam closed the logbook after writing the final line of the night. Light extinguished at dawn. Fog lifting slowly. All well at Wrenhaven Point. Then she opened the door to the first cool air of morning and listened as the village began again.